Our political editor, Andrew Clennell, has been here listening with me. So became a bit of a muted attack, I suppose, on Catherine King in the end. But this story is not going away. That is the decision to block more flights from Qatar Airways coming into Australia. What's the latest today on this?
Yeah, a lot of obfuscation from the government on this, and that's their problem. So I revealed yesterday that Foreign Minister Penny Wong telephoned the Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister of Qatar on Monday for a conversation where the issue of this invasive strip search of Australian women travelling on Qatar Airways in 2020 was raised. The Transport Minister, Catherine King, has now corrected comments she made in London in July and said that strip search incident was one factor in her controversial decision not to let 28 extra Qatar Airways flights a week into the country. So if the Foreign Minister is raising this now with her Qatari counterpart, has she raised it with him before in her 16 months as Foreign Minister? Well, I've discovered the answer is no. I'm told by government sources that upon hitting office, Ms Wong sought a briefing on the Qatar incident, and she instructed Australia's ambassador in Doha to chase justice for the women on the issue. In the end, one official at the airport got a suspended jail sentence over it. But this is the first time the minister has picked up the phone in relation to it to her Qatari counterpart, to that government. So why is the Foreign Minister making this call now? Well, she said in Jakarta yesterday it was a disturbing incident.
The Ahmad Airport incident, that's something I spoke about in opposition, and obviously was a very distressing event for the women concerned.
Not disturbing enough, apparently, though, to stop the Foreign Minister from accepting an upgrade to first class from Qatar Airways on September 25 last year. Yep, you heard it right. That's in the pecuniary interest register. And this is what Penny Wong would have experienced in first class on Qatar Airways.
Today, I'm flying on board Qatar Airways first class.
When you're in the lounge, my goodness, you know you're in a first class place.
Veuve Clicquot Le Grand Dame is served, much to my excitement. Let's check out the party piece, the private jacuzzi. As I started making my bed, the FA came over and insisted that she made it up for me.
Be hard to knock back, I suppose, wouldn't it? Just on that, Trade Minister Don Farrell on the 27th of July this year, about 2 weeks after the women in the 2020 incident were told of Ms King's decision around Qatar Airways, he accepted a business class upgrade with Qatar Airways. And as for Catherine King, well, today the incident in Qatar in 2020 has something to do with her decision on Qatar Airways.
I received a letter from Mark Lawyers on behalf of these women detailing their experiences, which are pretty awful. I consulted colleagues prior to the decision, but the decision was mine. I took the decision on the 10th of July, signed a letter to the women informing them that that decision had been made on the 10th of July. You can read what you want into that, but certainly it wasn't the only factor. It was.
What are the other factors? What are the other factors then?
Well, again, as I said, I don't think it's helpful for me to point to any one factor. We make decisions in the national interest all of the time.
But let me just again,
I haven't pointed to that as one factor.
Why would the Foreign Minister have made a phone call to Qatar's Prime Minister yesterday discussing that issue of the strip search? What does the government hope to get out of bringing that up in a month like this from Qatar?
I think that's a question you'll need to ask Minister Wong.
Okay, so now Qatar Airways' treatment of the Australian women in 2020 is one reason for the decision. But in July, shortly after making the decision, Catherine King sat down with Latika Burke from the Sydney Morning Herald. Look at this cosy sit down in London. And she said it had nothing to do with it. She denied in that article the reason for blocking Qatar was to do with the treatment of the women. She said, quote, "I wouldn't link the decision not to continue to engage with Qatar. I'm sure Qatar will continue to come to Australia and continue to ask for air rights. And we don't want to consider that at the moment."
All right. So where's it all heading with me? That she's been under pretty sustained pressure. I don't think anyone can have a clear explanation for what's happened here. As you've alluded to, maybe there gets down the track, Qatar's let in, but it's been pretty messy, hasn't it? There's another sitting week next week.
Yeah, and Well, it's obviously going to dominate next week until the Prime Minister and the Minister say, we spoke on this date, I ran my decision by him. It's pretty simple to come up with an answer that's not kind of in tricky word language. Maybe the PM doesn't want that. So, look, we read from that letter this morning from the Australian women who were the subject of the invasive strip search at the airport in Doha. The letter reads, quote, "You may or may not be aware of the situation that occurred, but on the night of 2nd of October 2020, a newborn baby was found in a rubbish bin in the transit area of Doha Airport. At this time, we were awaiting takeoff on board our flight. We were subsequently removed from the flight at gunpoint." It says, still under armed guard, most of us were forced to have bodily and vaginal examinations without consent. Some of us were threatened that if we did not cooperate, we would not be allowed back on the plane. Qatar Airways allowed and directed us to be taken off the flight, including one of us who was with her 4-month child at the time and one of us who's legally blind and in their 70s. We were kept hostage at gunpoint. Most of us were then examined vaginally without our consent. And the letter to the Minister goes on. This is the key bit in terms of her decision, I guess. "We gather from media reports that Qatar Airways is requesting more landing rights in Australian airports. It's our strong belief that Qatar Airways is not fit to carry passengers around the globe, let alone to major Australian airports. When you're considering Qatar Airways' bid for extra landing rights, we beg you, they say, to consider its insensitive and irresponsible treatment of us and its failure to ensure the safety and dignity of its passengers." Goes on, "We implore you to instead consider an airline that will uphold human rights." 13 days after this, the Minister writes back, July 10, saying she's shocked by what happened to the women. She says it's disgraceful and their experience, in her quotes, "remains in my thoughts as well as those of my colleagues." She says she consulted her colleagues, won't say which colleagues. And then she says the Australian government is not considering additional bilateral rights with Qatar. And she came under more pressure on this in question time.
Can the Minister inform the House which of her Cabinet colleagues she consulted with prior to making her decision on the application for additional Qatar Airways flights to and from Australia on July 10?
As I said yesterday, as you'd expect, my department undertook consultations with all the relevant aviation stakeholders, and I was well aware of different stakeholder views when I took this decision.
All right, and the Prime Minister was dodging questions when asked about this in Indonesia today.
Catherine King says that she spoke with colleagues prior to making the Qatar decision. It's domestic and international. It's domestic and international.
Last one.
Did she speak to you or seek your advice?
That is not.
Do you still have confidence in your Transport Minister?
Come on. Of course I do.